Shortly before Christmas in 1988, the residents of a small Scottish town called Lockerbie were just preparing dinner when suddenly, all hell broke loose. A rumble could be heard outside that sounded first like distant thunder, but soon grew to a roar until finally, a tremendous explosion shook the little village. Homes were set ablaze and the roofs of houses in whole sections of Lockerbie were blown away. When the residents of the town stepped outside, they were met by scenes straight out of a nightmare. Aircraft wreckage, debris and bodies lay strewn all across the town and the surrounding fields. What happened here in this most terrifying moment in 1988? Let's find out as we take a look at the infamous story of Pan Am Flight 103, the Lockerbie disaster, and how it forever changed the way we fly. Welcome to airspace. For a long time, when you thought of American aviation, you'd think of Pan Am. Pan American World Airways had been a very well-known airline for decades by 1988. At one point, it was the largest, most successful airline in the entire world. The Pan Am logo, the distinctive uniforms worn by its crew, and the beautiful airplanes they flew, known as Clippers, were iconic. The largest of these was the massive Boeing 747. Pan Am was the first airline to fly the 747 and at one point had over 30 of them in service. But all the nostalgia and reputation in the world couldn't disguise the fact that the airline was in deep trouble in 1988. Increased competition from both domestic and national carriers, as well as a series of poor business decisions, put Pan Am in deep financial trouble throughout the 80s. To get back on track, Pan Am needed its most profitable routes, like London to New York. Pan Am Flight 103 was one of these flights, scheduled to fly from Frankfurt via London Heathrow to New York JFK on the night of December 21st. The flight was carrying a total of 259 passengers, mostly Americans heading home for the holidays, but also including passengers from 20 other countries. At 6:25 in the evening, the flight lifted off from Heathrow's runway 27 right and headed northwest towards Scotland and the Atlantic Ocean. About 35 minutes later, just after entering Scotland, the Boeing 747 was cruising at 31,000 feet. In the cockpit, everything was quiet. But then, just when the crew was about to respond to a radio call by air traffic control, a loud noise was recorded on the cockpit voice recorder. On his radar screen, the controller in charge suddenly lost the transponder signal of Pan Am Flight 103. To his horror, the plane's radar signature suddenly split up into 5 distinct signals that slowly fanned out. A minute later, these radar echoes had spread out over an area of almost 2 kilometers or 1.25 miles. Moments later, a British Airways pilot radioed in and reported that he could see a huge fire on the ground. At this time, residents of a small, cozy Scottish town called Lockerbie had just prepared for dinner. Lockerbie is small with just about 4,000 residents. A town that you would usually probably pass on your way from here to somewhere else. But on this night, its name would go down in history. Shortly after 7 in the evening, residents heard a distant sound that could have been thunder. But the noise quickly grew into a roar and then, a huge explosion shook the town. When residents ran outside, they became witness to nightmarish scenes. Aircraft wreckage was falling all around them and bodies littered the street. Some were still strapped in their seats. The wing box of the 747, which is the sturdy structure where the wings were attached, had slammed into a home at near supersonic speeds, leaving a crater several stories deep. Throughout the night, residents, fire crews and police responded, trying to contain the flames and attempting to find survivors. At first, a flight attendant was found alive by a farmer's wife, but she perished before help could be summoned. When the dust had settled and dawn came, the tragic reality became obvious. None of the passengers or crew of Flight 103 had survived. Additionally, 11 residents of Lockerbie were killed in the explosion or the fire that followed, bringing the death count to 270. This would soon be remembered as the UK's deadliest air disaster. As the morning came, the sheer size of the debris field became obvious. The airliner had broken apart mid-air and strong winds had strewn the wreckage over an area greater than London, with the majority of parts coming down in Lockerbie. Just outside the town, the cockpit was found. The pilots and the flight engineer were still strapped to their seats. Switch positions inside the cockpit indicated that the trio had no advance warning as to what was about to happen to them. After the crash, the local police department, called the Dumfries and Galloway Constabulary, quickly started an investigation. It was aided by the FBI and the British Air Accidents Investigation Branch. Soon, the investigators and over 2,000 policemen started to collect what was left of the once majestic 747. Over the following weeks and months, over 4 million pieces of debris were collected and later reassembled in a hangar at Farnborough. Quickly, it became clear that there could be only two explanations for such an utter destruction to happen in flight. Either massive and sudden structural failure or indeed sabotage. When investigators analyzed the pieces of wreckage, they were soon able to tell that the bomb must have caused the in-flight breakup. Traces of soot were found on pieces of debris that originated in the forward cargo hold, just below the second A of the Pan Am logo you see here. When the bomb detonated, it ripped a 50 cm or 20-inch hole into the left side of the fuselage. The detonation was amplified by the rapidly escaping cabin pressure. The aircraft's elevator and rudder cables were cut, and the fuselage pitched downwards and to the left. Investigators concluded that the nose of the aircraft was blown off and separated from the main fuselage within 3 seconds of the explosion. It was briefly held on by a band of metal, but facing aft, like the lid of a can. It then sheared off, up and backwards to the right, striking off the number 3 engine and landing some distance outside town, on a hill in Thundergarth. The rest of the aircraft continued on for a while, slowly disintegrating. The fuselage, consisting of the main wing box structure, landed in Lockerbie's Sherwood Crescent, destroying 3 homes and creating a large impact crater. The 200,000 pounds, or 91,000 kilograms of jet fuel, ignited by the impact started fires, which destroyed several additional houses. Mercifully, most people on board Flight 103 must have become unconscious during the descent, either due to the large forces involved or due to a lack of oxygen. After it became known that this terrible crash had not been an accident but an act of terrorism, the search for one or multiple culprits began. Quickly, multiple organizations claimed responsibility for the bombing, but most claims were dismissed as false. A fragment of a circuit board found within another piece of wreckage eventually proved to be the decisive clue. It was matched to an electronic timing device manufactured by an electronics company in Switzerland called Mebo. Upon interviewing its owner in Zurich, investigators discovered the company had been doing business with the Libyan government and had sold 20 of the timing devices in question to the Libyans in 1985. Libya had pretty terrible relations with the United States at the time. Its leader, Muammar Gaddafi, had seized power in a coup in 1969, promising to end government corruption and to raise the standard of living for ordinary Libyans. But over the following decades, Gaddafi's regime had descended into a dictatorship where everything revolved around him. A cult of personality had sprung up around the leader figure. The problem was that Gaddafi was an impulsive person who at times made seemingly irrational decisions, especially when he was angry. He had fought wars with the neighboring countries of Egypt and Chad, and took steps to silence dissidents through an extensive intelligence and surveillance network. Occasionally, he also had critics killed by his intelligence service. Gaddafi above all hated the West and the United States in particular, calling it colonialist and oppressive. At the time, he was sponsoring many terrorist organizations, causing the US to put Libya on its list of state sponsors of terrorism in 1979. When Ronald Reagan took office in 1981, he took a stand against rogue nations like Libya. Gaddafi took this personally. He was also displeased by his portrayal in the Western media, which usually depicted him as a cartoonish figure swaggering around in a military uniform, making grand announcements he couldn't back up. But the height of the conflict between the United States and Libya was yet to come. This is the Gulf of Sidra, which takes up the center of the Libyan coastline. In 1973, Libya had claimed the entire Gulf as part of its territorial waters. This was a violation of the international law, which dictates that everything more than 12 nautical miles away from a country's coast is international waters open to everyone. Gaddafi claimed that the boundary of the Gulf of Sidra was a so-called line of death, and that any ship or aircraft that crossed it without Libya's permission would be subject to attack. The US did not accept this declaration. To oppose it, President Reagan ordered the US Navy into the Gulf of Sidra on what were called freedom of navigation exercises, asserting the Navy's right to sail or fly anywhere that they considered international waters. This was a direct challenge addressed to Gaddafi. An early incident in 1981 resulted in American fighter jets shooting down 2 Libyan planes, but it was in 1986 that things really started to escalate. In March of that year, the Navy sent an aircraft carrier strike group into the Gulf of Sidra and came under attack by Libyan naval vessels and missile installations. The resulting battle was a huge defeat for Gaddafi. Humiliated, he sent intelligence agents to West Berlin in the following April, where they bombed a nightclub popular with US servicemen, killing 3 and wounding over 200. 10 days later, Reagan retaliated by ordering a large-scale airstrike on Libya, killing an estimated 75 people and doing a lot of damage to Libyan military infrastructure. Following this, Gaddafi was reportedly humiliated by seeming unable to best his opponent and spent months in isolation in one of his desert palaces. Things got even worse for Libya and Gaddafi a year later, when US satellite intelligence proved crucial in a crushing defeat of the Libyan military by Chad, resulting in the end of Libya's invasion of that country, which had begun in 1983. At the time, Libya was growing more and more isolated due to its action, which resulted in various sanctions led by the United States. Gaddafi was left with a burning hatred for the nation in the West, and he demanded revenge. Another clue for the investigators were the clothing items that had been found inside the suitcase that had contained the explosive device. Most of these items had tags on them that read "Made in Malta." Investigators were eventually able to find the store that had sold the items. When they interviewed the staff there, one man was able to recall that he had sold several items to a Libyan-looking man. He was able to recall this event since the items the man had bought seemed odd to him: an umbrella and adult as well as baby clothes in various, seemingly random sizes. And indeed, part of these clothing items were the ones found among the wreckage. A composite sketch of the customer was created and later shown to the owner of the Swiss company Mibo, the one that had manufactured the timing devices used in the bomb. And indeed, the owner identified the man as being the same man that he had delivered the timing device to, a Libyan national called Abdelbaset al-Megrahi. Megrahi was officially the head of security for Libyan Arab Airlines, but was also thought to be an intelligence officer. He was believed to have been aided by a man called Lamin Khalifa Fima, a station manager at Malta Airport. Allegedly, the duo had prepared a suitcase containing the various clothing items mentioned before, as well as a Toshiba radio, which, in a terrible coincidence, was marketed as the Bomb Beat radio. This device contained a plastic explosive and the timer supplied by the Swiss company. It was then put on a flight from Malta to Frankfurt, where it was loaded onto Pan Am Flight 103, which would later continue on to London and eventually to New York. Megrahi never boarded any of these flights. In 1991, the Scottish police announced to the world that Megrahi and Fima were the 2 prime suspects in the Lockerbie bombing. Gaddafi and the Libyan government, however, refused to extradite the 2 nationals, much to the outrage of the rest of the world. It would take 8 years until Gaddafi was finally convinced to give the men up in an attempt to improve relations with the West. They were initially held at a former US Air Force base in the Netherlands, while they awaited trial in Scotland. 3 Scottish judges finally presided over the trial and eventually found Abdelbaset al-Megrahi guilty of 270 counts of murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. Lamin Khalifa Fima, on the other hand, was acquitted, since he was able to prove that he was in Sweden around the time of the bombing and that he could not have taken part. 8 years after his imprisonment, al-Megrahi was released on compassionate grounds after he had been diagnosed with prostate cancer. He had been given only months to live. Eventually, he lived on for 3 more years until he died at the age of 60. In the meantime, he had attempted to clear his name, but unsuccessfully so. Gaddafi and the Libyan government assumed responsibility for the bombing in 2003 and agreed to pay over $2 billion in compensation to the victims of the crash as part of a deal to lift UN and US sanctions. Gaddafi never went on trial for his actions, even though many believe he had at least prior knowledge to the bombing if he didn't outright order it. Destiny, however, reached him as well, when his dictatorship was violently overthrown and he was killed in 2011. Much later, in 2020, another Libyan national named Abu Aguila Mohammad Masoud Khir al-Marimi was captured by militia forces and handed over to the US authorities, where he is yet to stand trial. The man had been convicted of bomb making before and is believed to have also crafted the bomb that brought down Pan Am Flight 103. It is tragic how easily this bombing could have been prevented. The bag containing the bomb was put on 3 different flights, none of which transported the passengers it had belonged to. This is a violation of the passenger baggage reconciliation rule, which states that each piece of luggage must be accompanied by a passenger. It is designed precisely to avoid bombings. Both in Frankfurt and in London, Pan Am staff failed to detect that a bag was being loaded that had no accompanying passenger. This is even more alarming, considering the fact that the US intelligence services had warned about heightened terrorist threat at the time, with one specifically warning that a bomb would be loaded onto a US flight within the next 2 weeks. This led Pan Am to charge passengers an extra $5 security fee to, quote, provide a program that will screen passengers, employees, airport facilities, baggage, and aircraft with unrelenting thoroughness. It seems this process was not so unrelenting and thorough after all. One X-ray operator later confessed he only learned 11 months after the bombing about what plastic explosives were and how to spot them in the X-rays. This was one of the final nails in the coffin of Pan Am, which was found guilty of willful misconduct and faced with a massive $300 million lawsuit by the victims' families. The airline declared bankruptcy in 1991. After the bombing, passenger baggage reconciliation was made even more strict and is now a staple of airline security. It is now standard procedure around the world. Among all the terrible things that I described in this video, there were pleasant stories as well. During the first hours and days after the crash, Lockerbie residents were very welcoming of the families of the victims. They offered their remaining homes to them and provided accommodation and even offered free food and beverages to the visitors, despite having to suffer unspeakable things at the same time as well. A trio of women known as the Laundry Ladies even collected the pieces of clothing that the police had deemed as not important for evidence. They washed the items and returned them to the families of the victims so that they may receive them in better conditions than they had been found in. Many families still frequently visit Lockerbie, both to remember their lost loved ones and to visit the local townspeople. Many maintain long-lasting friendships with the people they shared their fate with on that terrible December night in 1988. I hope you liked my account of this terrible story. If you did, leave a like and make sure to subscribe to my channel. You'll find over 100 more videos on other accidents and aviation in general. And if you'd like to support my work long term, also make sure to check out my Patreon. Thank you so much for watching and see you all in the next one.